Good afternoon. My name is Kathy Creighton. I'm the director of the Cornell University's ILR office in Buffalo, New York. It's my pleasure to serve as host and moderator this hour for a discussion surrounding the state of labor and work in the United States, where we see changes coming under the Biden administration, and in particular, we're going to talk about the PRO Act. We're going to have time for Q&A from the audience, which stands at about 1,400 people. So send your questions to the chat function, and we'll try to get answered as many as possible. I want to introduce our speakers. Today, we have Secretary Tom Perez. Secretary Perez is an American success story. His parents are immigrants from the Dominican Republic. Tom grew up in Buffalo, New York. He attended high school not a half a mile from where I'm sitting right now. Tom then went to Brown University, JFK School of Government, and Harvard Law School. After clerking, Secretary Perez worked for the Department of Justice. He worked for Senator Ted Kennedy, and then in various positions in the Clinton administration. In 2013, Secretary Perez was nominated by Barack Obama to be Secretary of Labor, where he served until the end of the Obama administration. When Mr. Perez became Secretary of Labor, he took over in the aftermath of the Great Recession. He oversaw the longest streak of private sector job growth ever in America. He worked tirelessly every day for men and women who wake up in the morning and go to work. To highlight a few of his accomplishments, he worked on job training programs. He pushed for new overtime rules. He extended minimum wage and overtime protections to home health care workers. He put in place rules to protect workers' retirement savings and to protect them in their workplace with worker safety rules. After the 2016 election, Secretary Perez became the chairman of the Democratic National Committee. After guiding the party through Joe Biden's successful election, you might recall they had 24 people vying for the nomination. And after winning the Senate and the House for the Democrats, he decided to take a well-earned time off. Thank you, Secretary Perez, for being with us today. Our second guest is our hometown hero, Alex Colvin. He's the dean of the ILR School, which is my own alma mater, class of 1987. Dean Colvin grew up in Saskatoon, Canada, and it was probably due to the big sky in Saskatchewan that Dean Colvin wanted to, at first, study the stars. He attended the University of Toronto, where he received a bachelor's in science in astronomy and astrophysics. He later attended the University of Toronto Law School, where he received a JD. And it was at that time that he found his passion for the social sciences and researching and studying the world of work. He went on to earn a master's degree in industrial relations, and then he came to Cornell University, where he received his PhD from Cornell ILR School. Dean Colvin has been dean since 2019. It's universally regarded that Dean Colvin is just hitting it out of the park as dean. In addition to hiring new and innovative faculty and revamping the ILR curriculum into the 21st century, Dean Colvin maintains a very extensive body of research and writing. Indeed, the great Ruth Bader Ginsburg cited his research and writing in her Supreme Court decisions. Finally, on a personal note, Dean Colvin is just the nicest, cheerfulest, optimistic guy you can imagine. So today we have this great panel, and I'm going to start us off with asking the panelists. Let's start with Secretary Perez. How do you view the Biden administration in its support of labor and workers?
Well, I think they're off to a great start. Look at what's happened. The first 100 days of the Biden administration, more jobs were gained than in any 100-day period of that ilk in our history. You look at what he's done through executive action, the $15 minimum wage requirement for federal contractors. That's a big deal because there are so many contractors. For instance, if you try to go on to get your ACA coverage, a lot of those contractors are federal contractors who are making like $10 an hour. They're going to get a raise right now. And I think potentially most impactfully, he understands that the labor movement is really the heart and soul of how we build a thriving middle class. He understands history. He understands that when labor union density was at its highest in the 20th century, income inequality was at its lowest. And he understands that people need a right to organize. And when you can form a union, you can advocate for yourselves and for collective good. And so as a strong supporter of the PRO Act, I think President Biden understands that income inequality is one of the defining issues of our time. And there's no one magic bullet to address income inequality, but making sure that we can address the right to form a union, that we can grow the union movement, that is a key to addressing income inequality. So a lot more work to do, but I think the president's off to a really, really good start.
Maybe we can talk a little bit about the PRO Act. Dean Colvin, what is the PRO Act and why is it important?
Yeah, so the PRO Act is the latest attempt to reform our National Labor Relations Act. We have in some ways a venerable statute that governs our labor law. Started off in the 1930s and really hasn't been amended in major ways since the 1940s and late 1950s. So we're really talking about something that has been around for quite a significant period of time. And in some ways, even though it has protections for our basic rights, hasn't really kept up to date with the changes in the workplace and the needs of today's labor force. And so the PRO Act's an attempt to do a comprehensive update of the National Labor Relations Act to make it something that has stronger protections for union organizing, to protect the right to organize. And so it really would be a pretty dramatic strengthening of the National Labor Relations Act if it was passed.
One component of the PRO Act, it involves the workers' ability to sue on their own. Mm-hmm. Is that correct? And how is that important?
Yeah, that one, when I look at the PRO Act, there are some elements that have understandably gotten the most attention. As someone who spent my career in civil rights litigation and labor rights advocacy, having your day in court is really important. Supporting private rights of action is something that I think is critical. And what the PRO Act does is it expands the private right of action if the NLRB General Counsel fails to take the case. And so what does that mean? That means that if we have a Trump-like administration where you have a hostility to moving the ball forward, it's not game, set, and match once the general counsel says, I'm not going to do anything. Then you have the ability to go out there and go to court. I think that's critically important. It's also a safeguard against the underfunding of the agency, because I've watched civil rights and labor rights enforcement. Republicans often undertake the insidious strategy of not trying to repeal laws that they disagree with, but they simply starve the funding so that you can't really vindicate the rights. And if you don't have that private right of action to vindicate those rights, then frankly, those rights become really, really hollow. And what I like about this particular provision is that when we pass the PRO Act, this is a provision that I don't think the Supreme Court can take on, because this is Congress's will. And what the Supreme Court needs to do, and now I'm talking through the lens of conservative jurisprudence, you look at exactly what the body meant and what they said, and Congress has been very clear that you should have a private cause of action here, a private right of action. And so I think this is going to be, this could be an unsung hero of the PRO Act when it passes.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think this the enforcement parts of the Act are some of the most important. I think they tie together. So you get these enhanced remedies. You can get more substantial damages under the Act. Right now, one of the weaknesses of the NLRA is that the sanctions for breaking the law are relatively minimal. You don't have the potential sanctions that you would under most of our other laws. And so it's almost an invitation to break the law, and then you get, a sort of ticket as if you're jaywalking or something. And in order to have an effective vindication of your rights, to make it worth pursuing those private causes of action, you've got to have more substantial remedies. So the PRO Act, I think, is going to make a big difference if it comes through with this combination of changes to how we're enforcing the law.
What are some other substantial changes coming in the PRO Act with regard to organizing workers?
Well, making it easier to organize. I mean, when I was labor secretary, I was working vigorously on the effort to organize VW workers in Tennessee. Volkswagen is the largest auto company, or at least as of 2014 or whenever I was working on that issue, was the largest auto company in the world. And what was ironic is that in their global footprint, I think the only place where they didn't have a unionized workforce, and there might have been one or two other countries, but they're in like 20 countries. This is prior to when they had all those unconscionable issues about what they were doing with police. I was dealing with them prior to that. But the only place, or one of the only places where their workforce wasn't organized, was the United States. And that's nuts. The co-determination model they use in Germany, for instance, has allowed them to do a lot of really important things. And I'll tell you, the reason why that vote failed was real simple. The governor of Tennessee, the senators from Tennessee, they just threatened the heck out of them. And you saw most recently in Alabama with Amazon. All of these threats. Amazon had promised to build another fulfillment center. And then, in the run up to that, it was like, well, maybe not, and they put the fear of God into folks. I firmly believe that we should have a level playing field. Let's make sure that the vote, there's no thumb on the scale of the vote, that people can make informed judgments. And the PRO Act, I think, goes a long way to leveling the playing field. And that's all we're asking for. We're not asking for the thumb to be now on the scale for us. We're just asking for a fair shake. And that's really what's embodied in the PRO Act.
Something I'd highlight as a big change in terms of organizing potential is what happens when you get recognized as a union, you get the right to bargain, which is what these contests are all about when we have election. That's not the end of the story. What the research shows is that a substantial portion of the time, unions that get that right to bargain aren't able to get that first contract. You see a third or even a half of party is never getting that first contract. So the workers never get that benefit that they've sought out of organizing a union. And that often ends up crushing the union. The union ends up disappearing. So you've got to somehow get to that first contract. And so what the PRO Act has is a two-stage procedure. For first contracts, you'd first go to mediation, where you'd have a federal mediator come in and try and help the parties reach an agreement. If that doesn't work, if there's an inability to get to that first agreement, an arbitrator will come in and come up with a first contract to just get the parties started on that process. Only for the first one. After that, they go back to bargaining like normal. But at least it gives the workers who've unionized that first step towards collective representation. And I think that's a really critical part of the PRO Act.
Right. That is something, is that something that appears in other first world countries' labor laws, Dean Colvin? Yeah,
that's specifically something that we've seen in my home country, Canada. It's a routine part of labor relations there, getting new unions over that kind of first hump to organize. I think it frankly puts pressure on the parties as well to negotiate their own agreement. You don't actually have to use that first contract arbitration, but if you know it's there, it's a tool to put pressure on the parties to negotiate in good faith to reach an agreement, which is what we want them to do ultimately. It's just to sit down, bargain, reach an agreement. But we see it working in Canada. Often comparisons are made to countries like France, right? France always gets pulled out as comparisons. Well, Canada's just over the border, right? I mean, from Buffalo there, I think you could walk in half an hour and you'll be in Canada. And it's not been the end of the world, right? Canada has a functioning capitalist system. It's a relatively successful country. We can borrow ideas from Canada.
Well, and the other aspect of that, I agree with 1,000% of what Dean Colvin said, and I had a 15-minute drive to the border from where I was. The thing about, I think a lot of employers understand that time is often on their side. So if you slow walk, you have this, the momentum that comes from a successful organizing campaign. If members then see nothing that comes of it, eventually that momentum stagnates, and they know that, and that's why the current status quo. I mean, I'm a basketball fan. It's like this coach North Carolina, Dean Smith. He used to do the four corners offense. Slow it down, and that's exactly what's happening in many situations. Let's slow it down, and put it off. And then sometimes you see campaigns to decertify because there have been insidious efforts there. So I think, once again, this is a good example of we need to follow Canada's lead and move forward.
There's a question in the chat where someone asked if we agree or disagree with the statement that the PRO Act has a lot of bits and pieces, but it lacks a general cohesive nature of employer-employee relationships. Do either of you agree with that or disagree with that?
Well, I mean, you can go, Dean.
Yeah. So I think what the PRO Act's focus is, it's a statute designed to rehabilitate the National Labor Relations Act, right? It's designed to kind of redeem that sort of 1930s promise of establishing collective bargaining. It doesn't actually do some of the more radical changes that have been talked about, certainly in academic and policy circles. And I think there are some interesting ideas out there, right? There's been a lot of discussion around sectoral bargaining, that we should have sort of industry-wide bargaining, which they have in a number of European countries, as a way of kind of getting broader-based collective bargaining, or establish something like works councils, like they have in Germany, that give workers voice through this alternative mechanism that every workplace has a right to. So it actually doesn't go to those more substantial changes. It's in some ways a more kind of incremental American style labor law reform effort. So I think that's sort of a choice that's been made to try and fix the current system, try and have more robust collective bargaining of the style that we're used to here.
Yeah, I mean, I hosted a multi-day conference when I was labor secretary on the future of work, and we talked about a lot of what Dean Colvin just mentioned, sectoral bargaining. How do we address a lot of app-based employment? I don't refer to it as gig employment, because actually gig employment has been around for decades and decades. Talk to many construction workers; they go from gig to gig. But again, the Ubers and TaskRabbits and all of that has presented a whole new set of challenges, which aren't addressed directly in the PRO Act. But for me, what the PRO Act is about is leveling the playing field. The playing field just isn't level right now. And I also think it reflects the fact that, in our country right now, if you try to have a conversation about a lot of these other issues, I don't know that consensus has fully formed about what to do about those issues. And so I think we need to continue to have those future work conferences. We need to continue to see the states serve as incubators of innovation. Unfortunately, I've seen at least one example of where I think it hasn't exactly gone that way, but it illustrates my point. We need more time to work on those issues. But I'll tell you, when the PRO Act gets passed, this is going to be a big deal. I mean, again, I keep coming back to what I said at the outset, Kathy, which is, remember where we were. When America's greatest generation fought after World War II, so many of those American heroes then ended up being shop stewards and ended up being part of that remarkable union movement. And we had a 35-year period where when wages went up, growth went up, they went hand in hand. Workers shared in the spoils of our prosperity. And again, income inequality was at its lowest in the 1950s when labor union density was at its highest. And then we started to see that decoupling around 1980, where workers were still working hard, but they weren't sharing in the spoils of success. And not coincidentally, a big part of that was unrelenting efforts to undermine the right to organize. I mean, look at, I haven't seen the most recent data, but we've got about 120 million private sector workers and maybe 20 to 25 million public sector workers. And yet, you look at the unionization rates and they're just night and day. And there's a lot of factors for that. And I think that this PRO Act is going to help us to expand union density. And when we expand union density, we expand the middle class. And that's what it's all about, helping people get in and stay in the middle class.
The latest statistics from the Bureau of Labor Statistics show, Dean Colvin, that the rate of union membership for the private sector in the United States now stands at a paltry 6.3%. Do you think that labor is just dead, or do you think that the PRO Act will change things, or that there's a sense, this is a 10-part question, which I should never do, or do you have a sense that America is looking to change to be more acting in solidarity in a workplace?
Yeah, I think you can't deny these changes that have happened over time in certainly private sector unionization. The public sector has actually stayed remarkably stable, which is the great sort of counterfactual that public sector employers tend not to engage in a lot of the union opposition that you see in the private sector. But private sector unionization has really shrunk down to this kind of core, I think smaller than many in the public realize just how much under siege private sector unions have been. How much and how quickly could the PRO Act turn that around? I think it's a bit of an unknown question. It certainly takes a long time. You can't just change the world with laws, right? It depends on the labor movement. Is it going to be out there organizing? It's been interesting to me seeing actually in recent years some of the signs of life in terms of the labor movement's own activity, as well as some of the organizing we've seen in places like Bessemer, Alabama. You see the Red for Ed teacher strikes a couple of years ago that were a pretty dramatic example of union activity, labor activity in some states that we didn't really traditionally think of as hotbeds of labor activity. And we saw the Fight for 15 campaign, which is a campaign for minimum wage, but very heavily pushed by the labor movement. And so I think there is something interesting in the air going on. There's some uncertainty as to which direction we're going to go in. Certainly you see in the public opinion polls that unions have a much more favorable view than they've had for quite a while, particularly amongst younger respondents, which is really interesting and I think potentially significant. So, so there's obviously a lot of uncertainty there, but I think there is this potential change in the air that we haven't seen for a while.
I mean, there were jobs that were around in the 50s, 60s, and 70s that are simply not here. Kathy, you grew up in Buffalo. When I was a kid, I was a kid when my dad died, and I had a lot of friends whose dads worked at Bethlehem Steel or Republic Steel. There were 20,000 employees at those places. There was a country club, next to Bethlehem Steel. I mean, you could have a 10th grade education and be a proud homeowner and have a life that enabled you to live with dignity and to have a future. And those jobs, we know the story of those jobs, and they're simply not as plentiful. The Tesla plant in Buffalo, New York, which used to be, if my memory serves me, the Republic Steel plant.
Republic. Mm-hmm.
I toured that plant when I was labor secretary. And the challenge there is they're paying like $15 an hour. My friends' dads who were working there were making in the 70s, fully loaded, something like $30 an hour. And so we've got to figure out, and this is where I think Joe Biden has his finger on the pulse. As we build clean energy jobs, and I live in Maryland, and I proudly live in Maryland, I think a huge engine of our future economy, not only in Maryland, but up and down the eastern seaboard, is offshore wind. Mm-hmm. And those are opportunities to create really good middle-class jobs. The component parts for offshore wind are currently manufactured nowhere in the United States. I think it's mostly in Europe. We should be manufacturing in the Port of Baltimore. We should be then creating jobs, working with our community colleges to build that pipeline of apprentices that are going to make those component parts, that are going to service offshore wind. It is a total win-win-win. Win for union workers, win for employers, win for the environment. And again, the thing about it that's different with Joe Biden in charge is he doesn't cough up a furball when you say union. He doesn't cough up a furball when you say project labor agreement. He wants these jobs to be union jobs as we address climate change. As he said in many speeches, when I think of climate change, I think of good jobs. And he is exactly right. So as we think about how to increase that private sector density number from 6.3 to higher, I think the clean energy sector holds a lot of promise in moving forward.
Yeah, I want to pick up on that point about the president's voice, because I think for those of us outside in academia, if you look taking the longer view, it is really a striking shift. I teach my students about the great organizing drives of the 1930s and in Flint and other communities. And yeah, the law was changing during that point in time, but a big part of what was going on was workers saying the president is on our side. And it was FDR making speeches supporting the labor organizing of the day that had a big impact. If we look in the history, it's not just what goes on in courtrooms or government agencies. It's also the president's voice. And it is really striking listening to Biden talk about labor and talk about unions in this, I would say, dramatically clear way that he is articulating a really clear pro-union perspective. And historically, I think that's a really important shift.
Yeah. I mean, I always used to tell people who enter government, whether you're the labor secretary or someone else, understand what your leverage points are. You have the ability to enforce the law, whether it's wage and hour laws, OSHA, MSHA. whatever the civil rights laws. You have the authority to issue regulations. That's really important. You have the authority, you have grant-making authority. And we use our grant-making authority really catalytically and synergistically. You have the authority to issue executive actions, which are different from regulations under OSHA. But those executive actions, like the $15 an hour minimum wage, or the creation of an interagency climate council, that are going to enable us to better draw our synergies and implode stovepipes. And then what Dean Colvin, the other one, and I was really high on this, the convening authority that you have, which is part and parcel of the bully pulpit authority. We used our convening authority to bring together diverse stakeholders around these issues. And what's really, I think, a staple of the Biden administration is they're using all of those tools in the toolbox. And I've not seen this in quite some time, where talking about unions, you heard him reference the IBEW in his speech a couple weeks ago. That wasn't an accident. That is, again, another statement to union workers who felt forgotten. Why did Trump win? He won because he was able to appeal to this sense of insecurity that people have. And what Joe Biden has been able to show is that Donald Trump was a carnival barker. He purported to speak your language, but it's actually Joe Biden who's going to work to make sure that we have these project labor agreements in the infrastructure bill. So we're creating good union jobs. The reason why there was no infrastructure bill under Trump is because they wanted infrastructure that would basically line the pockets of Wall Street investors. They had no interest in repairing water pipes because you can't monetize that in ways that they wanted to. So I really think that the dean is onto something here. And again, I really applaud the president for the holistic use of all of those tools that I outlined. And I think this is a really historic set of opportunities moving forward.
It's interesting to me that, prior to the passage of the National Labor Relations Act in 1935, you could just simply be fired for saying you supported a union. It was perfectly legal and was done all the time by employers. That now we're at this other moment after a pandemic, similar to maybe where the FDR administration was after the Great Depression, where we see workers who are just not happy with their situation for obvious reasons.
We are at a generation. We're at a once in a generation moment right now, Kathy and Dean Colvin and all who are listening. I had the privilege of enforcing labor laws at the Department of Labor, and the majority of the laws I enforced were, by and large, this is a slight overstatement, but by and large a product of the New Deal. And before that, I was heading up the Civil Rights Division. And again, this is a slight overstatement, but most of the laws I enforced were largely a product of the Civil Rights Movement of the 60s. These were two eras of great angst in our country, great division in our country, great suffering in our country, and great accomplishment. We rewrote the social compact in these 2 decades on issues of fundamental importance. And I think we're at another one of those generational moments. And I think Joe Biden and Kamala Harris get it. They understand that this is not a time for the faint of heart. This is not a time to set as a goal, I want to be where we were in March of 2020 when the pandemic started. That's not the goal here. Our goal is to get us where we need to be for decades to come. And I think the president understands, and the vice president understands, that reforming labor laws are indispensable to rewriting the social compact and addressing income inequality. The pandemic exacerbated the income inequality. It did not cause it to begin with. That was happening for decades before this. And we do have this generational moment now. And I know that the president's working hard to seize it, and I hope he can.
I'm going to go to the audience, which has a number of questions on the PRO Act. Makes it so that right to work laws, it takes out that they cannot enact right to work laws, and currently 27 states out of all of our union have right to work laws. So maybe you want to take a crack at that, Dean, and explain what that right to work is and what does the PRO Act do? Sure.
So right to work is one of those things that was added into the National Labor Relations Act and the Taft-Hartley Act back in 1947, and essentially allows an individual state to pass a law saying that unions and management cannot negotiate a contract that charges a fee, a representational fee to all the workers who are represented by the union. We have a system where the union has to represent all the workers in a bargaining unit, the workers that it negotiates a contract for. But in a right-to-work state, only the workers who are members of the union pay the fees to pay for the bargaining. So this is kind of an unusual feature of our labor law. Our labor law is, in almost all other respects, a national law. It's the same everywhere in the country, but the Taft-Hartley Act allowed certain states to become right-to-work states and opt out of this part of labor law. I think that the right-to-work states, it's in some senses a bigger thing than though just that technical thing about paying union dues. It's a symbolic aspect, right? It's a symbolic statement that it's a state that isn't friendly to private sector unions. So when you saw Wisconsin becoming a right-to-work state, right? That was sort of under Scott Walker. That was kind of a symbolic step to say that the state was moving in a direction away from unions. And right to work has certainly been used as a badge in recruiting companies to locate in states. We certainly see that with some of the foreign car makers who located in the southern states, being attracted there by these statements that the states are right to work states. So it's a bigger issue than just the technical aspect of the law there. I think it's an important symbolic issue. And that would be a big change under the PRO Act. It would be a statement about a national standard in labor law.
One of the questions said, if it was in the state constitution, could the PRO Act trump that? In other words, would the federal law preempt the state's constitution? I don't know the answer. I think that it would preempt it, but
I think it would preempt it. Preemption doctrine is one of these things we all struggled in law school. Anybody who's a lawyer on the call, but I think that is the case because it's a federal area of regulation, and that's been well established constitutionally. So I don't think the state constitution would matter there, at least for the private sector. Right.
We have questions on that a freelancer from California says that he is concerned that the changes to the PRO Act and independent contractor status, the ABC, now we're getting really into the weeds, would hurt him or her as a freelancer. So what does the PRO Act, Dean Colvin, say about independent contractor status or misclassification?
Yeah, so we've had a long-standing set of standards about who's an independent contractor. There's something called the control test that you're an employee, not an independent contractor, if the company can control how you do the work. What the PRO Act does is sets up a test. It's a little simpler test. Right now, there's something called the IRS 20-factor test. There's 20 different things you look at to determine someone's an independent contractor. The ABC test, which is originated in California, the PRO Act would adopt, sets three criteria for whether somebody's an independent contractor or an employee. And it does broaden the definition of who gets employment status, employment rights, right? And that's essentially what the test is all about, is who gets that set of rights. So if the PRO Act's passed, it would broaden out who's getting the protections of labor law. So some people who currently might be considered independent contractors would gain the right to organize a union if they choose. And so that would be a shift. It doesn't mean that there aren't going to be independent contractors, genuine independent contractors, but there's a lot of people in a gray area right now. And this is a real issue in our economy. There's real incentives to kind of create gray areas of people who are sort of independent, but sort of not, right? I mean, you look at sort of an Uber driver, right? In some sense, they have some independence in terms of like time and so on, but Uber has an enormous number of rules saying what you do if you're an Uber driver, right? It's not like you're just hanging out your own shingle. You're getting your job, your work through the app, and the app has all kinds of rules that you have to follow. So this is a pretty big issue, I think, in the economy today.
Well, I'll tell you, talk about a full employment act. If you look over the last decade, the Bush administration, when we were working in the Obama administration on the overtime rule, the Bush administration had changed the interpretation of what constitutes overtime eligibility, and basically, in a nutshell, took all the leverage away from workers and gave it to employers. So you had people who were stocking shelves for 99% of their time, and then 1% they were doing management work, and they were an exempt employee. And actually what happened as a result of that, and what I find really interesting, is that the Republicans don't like litigation. They spawned, through that regulation, a tidal wave of litigation because it was so just so anti-commonsensical that you could work literally. There was a case out in South Carolina involving someone who had been stocking shelves 98 or 99% of the time. And, I think this is, I hope that the clarity, and I'm not confused, this ABC test will spawn a new set of litigation. It'll just be a different set of litigation. I think we will perennially be providing full employment acts for plaintiff and employer side lawyers. So lawyers who are watching this, you need not fear for your professional future, because this will continue to be there. But again, I think there's a North Star in everything that is in the PRO Act. And that North Star is leveling the playing field, giving workers a better shake, understanding at the end of the day that when that happens, when we return some leverage to workers, which has been lost for a host of reasons over a course of decades, that helps us lift wages, lift conditions of work, and lift dignity. That's really the through line in just about everything that I see in the PRO Act.
One of the things in the PRO Act, and there's several questions on it, is and it sounds like the piecemeal question that somebody asked, but it was about mandatory arbitration, which, Dean, you have done a lot of research on in your academic life. Yeah. What is mandatory arbitration, and how would the PRO Act change it?
Yeah, so mandatory arbitration, it gets confusing because arbitration is used in a lot of different settings. Some settings very successfully. Unions and management negotiate together arbitration agreements for enforcing their contracts, something that both sides accept and works very well. The difference with a mandatory arbitration procedure is you didn't negotiate it. It's something that's given to you as a condition of employment. The employer says, if you want the job, you've got to agree to this arbitration procedure, which the employer has created, has put in place. So it's not something that you negotiate. It's used in a lot of settings, consumer settings as well. Your cell phone contract includes a mandatory arbitration clause. How do I know that? Because all cell phone contracts include a mandatory arbitration clause. So Verizon, AT&T, you've agreed to that. But in the workplace, a lot of employees nowadays, over half employees, according to my research, are covered by these, and they mean that you cannot go to court. You have to go to arbitration to resolve your civil rights claims, their employment rights. And again, there's settings when arbitration works very well, but what we're finding is where it's imposed, it's one-sided, it can have really deleterious effects. You don't get the same chance of winning. You don't get the same damages. It's hard for plaintiff attorneys to take your case on, and it really inhibits the enforcement of our civil rights laws, our wage and hour laws. Of particular concern, the Supreme Court a couple of years back in a case called Epic Systems said that this could also bar you from bringing a collective action or a class action lawsuit. So you can't band together groups of workers to raise a legal claim together. And that's a major inhibition to bringing employment law claims.
And again, this is another example. And Dean Colvin, thank you for the research that you have done that, as you know, has been cited at the highest levels that documents the impact of this, and will provide a really important factual basis when the PRO Act becomes law and is invariably challenged by some folks who don't like it. I think this is another example of something that even if you adopt the conservative jurisprudence, the Congress has spoken, will have spoken when we pass this. The president will have signed it, and that should be game, set, and match. And if that happens, and if and when we expand private rights of action when the GC fails to act, these are really good examples of how, again, we're leveling the playing field. That's what this is about.
So there's a lot of questions where it says, why are we even having this conversation? Because is this going to pass the Senate? What about filibuster? How can we get it passed? Can certain parts of the PRO Act pass without filibuster? Those kinds of questions. Mm-hmm. And, I mean, that could take up that could take up 6 hours of conversation.
Yeah, I'm happy.
Let's start it
with that. Yeah, I think I worked for Ted Kennedy, and boy, I remember when I first started working for him, they said that we're never going to be able to raise the minimum wage. I started working for him back in '95 when I had hair, and sure enough, 18 months later, President Clinton had signed an increase in the minimum wage. Here is one pathway, and I don't know. I mean, we still have work to do, and it obviously. I went to law school because I didn't really want to do math, but we're going to do some math here. It's very simple math. We need 50 senators. Okay. That's the math. And here's how I think one could do it. You first pass it in the House as part of the next infrastructure package. So you have the PRO Act embedded in that. And then, obviously, you need to have conversations with the senators who may have questions. If my memory serves me, Senator Manchin is a co-sponsor of the PRO Act, and so he is on board. I know there are a couple other senators who are not. I have respect. I'm talking about on the Democratic side. I have respect for them, and I'm confident that we can work hard to persuade them. In Arizona, for instance, the United Food and Commercial Workers has a huge presence there. They're a big part of the infrastructure out there, and I know they're big supporters. Mark Perone, the president, is a spectacular union leader. And what would likely happen if you had it in a budget reconciliation bill, there would be in the Senate an objection raised, and the parliamentarian will have to rule on whether it is in order to have the PRO Act as part of budget reconciliation. So let's assume for this conversation that the parliamentarian says it is out of order. There is a remedy for that. And that remedy is a simple vote to overrule the parliamentarian. The parliamentarian is not an omnipotent figure. This is not papal infallibility. You can vote to overturn and override the parliamentarian. And that is one pathway to pass the PRO Act. Now, again, in order to do that, you need 50 votes. But the challenge right here, Republicans have so misused the filibuster that, and they've misused it in the civil rights context. We need H.R. 1. And we need these labor reforms. And you don't need to completely get rid of the filibuster in order to do it. So again, I've just outlined a pathway where you could pass the PRO Act as part of a reconciliation package in connection with the infrastructure bill that will be introduced in Congress. And again, the linchpin is making sure that you have spoken with all the parties involved. I think that is a potentially elegant solution to the challenge. I think it's going to be more difficult to get the filibuster eliminated writ large, but you can accomplish a lot without getting rid of the filibuster writ large. You can get rid of it for certain categories of legislation. I think we're going to have to deal with that sooner rather than later, because Republicans are refusing to do anything on voting rights, notwithstanding the fact that in 2007, when we reauthorized the Voting Rights Act, every single Republican senator voted for it. And every House member, except 5 or 6, voted for it. And now suddenly they don't want to. So these are challenging times. And the remedy that I would suggest anyone watching this who wants to see the PRO Act passed is to get out there and outline to your senators that there's an imperative to get this through, and there's actually a way to get this through. The shortest distance theory takes a little beating, but I just want to get to the end point, and I think we can.
Dean Colvin, do you think that there's any chance of that happening at this juncture? What Secretary Perez says?
I think what's interesting has been that if we look back to the last time there was a major labor law reform effort around EFCA, this is almost a dozen years ago now. That in many ways
that was the Employee Free Choice Act.
Employee Free Choice Act, yeah, at the beginning of the first Obama administration, the first term. The EFCA did not in some ways go as far as the PRO Act in being a comprehensive set of reforms. It's a very particular target of things there, but it didn't quite have as close to universal support amongst Democrats that you're seeing with the PRO Act. And I think that is an interesting shift. It's become more, I think, recognized that it's a fundamental part of the Democratic labor, economic, social agenda in a way that has increased since that point in time. And I think that does suggest something about this shift in thinking as we've looked at the challenges facing the country right now, and frankly, a reaction to some of the success Trump had in reaching out to blue-collar communities and gaining votes there. But there's certainly some shift in the broader political winds that I do think there's more support for labor law reform than there was in the past.
One of the listeners points to a Gallup poll from 2020 saying that 65% of people asked had approved of unions, which is obviously far fewer than the number of people who are members of a union. I think it's 30% of public sector employees are unionized, about 30%. And then the question was, that question is, what specific incentives does the PRO Act have for people to form unions in a workplace, which we discussed a little bit, but that 65% might be something of what you're talking about, Dean. Yeah,
that's exactly right. And that has risen noticeably just the last few years. And I do think it's a change in our economic climate. We're still seeing the sort of long-term effects of the Great Recession that I think had a significant impact, particularly on the younger generation. People who we saw graduating from college here, at the time of the Great Recession. That's a tough job market to go into, and it affects how people think. I think the reality of the finance industry, the crash, and the feeling that the system was kind of rigged against young people and people trying to get jobs and establish, a basic middle class standard of living that we kind of took for granted in the past. I do think that's behind this shift, and you're seeing it in multiple areas. The Fight for 15 campaign is one that's really struck me over the last few years. That I remember when that started, I thought, wow, interesting idea, but that'll never go anywhere. And the fast food workers who campaigned behind it, kept pushing, and some of the state labor movements got behind it. SEIU up in Washington State, David Rolfe and the SEIU local there, they really pushed behind this, and it's continued to spread. I was really struck last November that Florida, the voters voted in favor of the $15 an hour minimum wage. That says something about where the country's sort of appetite for change around labor and employment issues is. I think there's a striking appetite for change. If it's not the PRO Act, there's going to be something else coming along. I don't think this issue is going away. I think the PRO Act is in some ways kind of a way of addressing these issues through a bargaining process that's an alternative to other kinds of reforms. But I don't think the issue is going away.
And it's not just in so-called blue states. I mean, you look at the number of ballot initiatives in so-called red states over the course of the last 8 years on minimum wage. 100% of them passed. Now, they weren't going to $15 an hour, but 100% of them passed, usually by double-digit margins. Yeah. There's an acute understanding across America that workers are taking it on the chin. The playing field isn't level. And I know I sound like a broken record, but if people want to know what the PRO Act's about, it's about leveling the playing field and giving people a sense that we're going to be on your side now, and we're going to give you that fair shake, because income inequality is one of the defining issues of our time, and it is about time. It's long past due time, I would argue, for us to take this on head on. And again, I applaud the president and the vice president. The stimulus bill that already passed is a muscular effort to do that, to address child poverty, to address other issues. And we need to keep going. We need to understand the moment in time we're in right now. And it is, I think, a once-in-a-generation moment in time to really redraw that social compact.
Secretary Perez, I know you were head of the DNC, so you're obviously partisan in this conversation. And, that's great. But I wonder if this is a red-blue issue, or if this is a worker issue that does transcend party lines.
Yeah, I mean,
we have about 3 minutes left in our talk.
Well, and the answer to that is, if you go outside the Beltway, it is not a red-blue issue. It's a red, white, and blue issue. I mean, you look at the reaction across America to the American Rescue Plan. There's strong bipartisan support for it. Go talk to Republican mayors. They are so happy and grateful to Joe Biden. Talk about people who got $1,400 checks. And there's even Republican members of Congress going in their districts touting aspects of the American Rescue Plan that they voted against. So I think what we have to do is take the case directly to the American people. When the president spoke 2 weeks ago, he wasn't really speaking, in my judgment, to the folks who were in that chamber, the Republicans, that is, because they have been captured by Donald Trump. I think the way we pass the PRO Act, the way we continue to move forward on infrastructure and other things that we need to do, the American Families Plan, is to take the case directly to the American people and tell them what's in it, because we need to address our elder care infrastructure, our child care infrastructure. Women took it on the chin in this pandemic. Why? Because they're caregivers. And they were the principal folks who had to leave the labor force. Joe Biden understands that, and we're rewriting that social compact in these things. But we got to go directly to the American people, and that's exactly what we're doing.
So, Dean Colvin, we have about 30 seconds left. Do you want to wrap up our PRO Act conversation this afternoon?
Well, I think it reflects that this is a set of issues that the American public cares about. Again, they care about employment, they care about the future of work, they care about jobs. They care about what it's going to mean for their families going forward. I think this is reflecting something that's going on in this country. This country is realizing that there's a set of issues that need to be addressed, and I think this is a conversation that needs to be had now.
Thank you both so much for joining us this afternoon, and we'll continue this conversation another time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dean.